Welcome everyone to the WFG Employee Education Series. My name is Elena Arroyo, Client Engagement Manager at Washington Financial Group. Today we are going to be talking a little bit about controlling your finances and ways to reduce debt and build savings. With me today I have Joseph F. DeNoyer, CEO of Washington Financial Group, weighing in, and I also have Colin Clark, who is our retirement specialist. And we are going to be starting off discussing some topics regarding personal balance sheets, what we consider to be good versus bad debt. There are several different opinions and outlooks there regarding those things, as well as rule of thumbs, and how we can know if you're overextended, and also the importance of creating a budget. So with that, we are going to open the floor and talk a little bit about how you can manage a personal balance sheet. So if you look, you should have a worksheet number 1. We are going to be going through how we create a personal balance sheet and whether or not this is something that we should be adhering to on a daily basis.
Hello, Elena. How are you?
I'm great. How are you, Colin?
Good. I know that when I'm meeting with employees on a regular basis, the number one question I get is, "Hey, am I on track for retirement?" Right? But
yeah, absolutely.
From a financial planning standpoint, I usually look at things from a checklist standpoint, and so we want to do things like take an inventory of where we stand.
Yeah.
And so that's where worksheet number 1 comes in. We want to have a personal balance sheet and really list out our assets, our liabilities, and make sure that we know where we stand.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you are doing this with one of the employees that we usually work with, do you take a holistic perspective and do it from a family standpoint, or do you do it per individual?
Well, you definitely want to take into account, every aspect of a household.
Okay.
And that's where you want to make sure that you're taking into account, your housing, your discretionary, non-discretionary spending, making sure that you're listing out any sort of assets. And an asset is something like a bank account, a brokerage account, anything that you own that has some value. And then your liabilities is your things like your debt, your mortgage, car loans, any credit cards, things where you're going to owe someone money. And then we can then determine whether or not where we stand from the balance sheet standpoint. Do we have more debt, to assets? Mm-hmm. And then we can figure out, well, is our debt level too high?
Great. And so you can see at the bottom of the balance sheet here, it says subtract 3 months of living expenses. Joe, do you feel like 3 months is a good starting place? And then from there, what do you usually recommend to employees and to just people in general when we're talking about financial planning?
Yeah, so 3 months living expenses is a good way to start thinking about having an emergency fund and really building up a fund in case something happens, right? So there's always these different things. We kind of joke about it, but the same day the furnace blows up, the transmission falls out of your car. And for many folks, it's a tough situation when you have this emergency. And where would you go? So unfortunately, a lot of Americans now count on using their credit card to get through an emergency.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then they tend to always fall behind because, emergencies seem to happen at the worst time. That's why they're called emergencies. So we like the idea of having 3 months living expenses and then in a reserve fund or an emergency expense fund, and then expand from there if you can. So continue to save each month a little bit to build on that, because ideally if you can have 6 months living expenses in an emergency fund, you're generally in better shape, because most emergencies won't take up more than that.
Right.
But it's a really good starting point.
Right.
You're describing my house in 2017. I lost my HVAC, all my appliances, and I had to replace all the tires in my car. So it sounds very familiar.
Yeah, and you're not alone, Colin, because it happens often. And the folks we sit down with and we're talking to them, we ask them to think about the last time they had an emergency, and it always comes something with a home repair and the car at the same time, or
absolutely.
Forget it if your kid needs braces and it's unexpected, because that's more than 3 months. So, but it's a good thing to just start focusing on that 3 months living expenses.
Yeah, and I think the statistic is somewhere around like 47% of Americans have less than $1,000 in an emergency account, and then the rest is relied on by a credit card. So it's definitely something that's really important to be thinking about. when we're talking about creating a personal balance sheet, and that actually does, when we talk about, having to use your credit card, that really ties into the debt component. So if we are looking over at worksheet number 2, is your debt level too high? The rule of thumb that we usually use is if you're spending greater than 20% of your after-tax income on managing all of your debt expenses, then you may be sort of overextended. So what do you think about when we talk about good versus bad debt, and what's sort of your rule of thumb when it comes to managing these sort of things, and what are some solutions that you can offer to people who do feel like they're overextended?
Well, you hear, personal finance gurus, and I won't name any names, they talk about, mortgage debt is good debt.
Right.
But interestingly enough, I was just speaking with a couple, over the holidays, and they were asking, hey, how much should I be spending on my house?
Yeah.
And a lot of folks will say, oh, a third.
Yes.
And especially, depending on what area of the country you live in, that can really become part of your budget really quickly.
Yeah.
And so you have to be very smart when you're saving up for that first home purchase. And I know if you listen to financial news and things like that, people are waiting longer to purchase their first home, and I think people are starting to become a little bit more cognizant of how much of their mortgage their monthly budget's becoming.
Yeah.
And so people are being a little bit smarter about that.
Right.
Yeah, and then you'd pile on that bad debt would be consumer debt. It's everybody wants the 80-inch flat screen TV, the 4K, the latest thing, whatever it is. But if you don't really have the money sitting aside to buy something, you have to think twice about it. And I know that it's hard to do, but many times people just get wrapped up in consumer debt, and so that's buying stuff, not that you need, but stuff that you want, and charging it. So that debt tends to outweigh some of your overall budget needs, and over time, if you just keep piling that on, it becomes very difficult to go back to that emergency account we talked about, or actually save going forward. So worksheet 2 does a really nice job of getting people to think a little bit differently about the debt, and allowing them to work through, hey, are we overextended or not? Because you may take this little quiz here and you find out that you're overextended, so then the next question is what we're going to do about it. So that's really important to know where you are, just like when you go through the balance sheet. It's just kind of take a snapshot where you are so you can move forward and try to meet some of your goals and objectives.
Yeah, absolutely. So what would you recommend for people who do feel like they're overextended? What sort of options do they have in order to sort of get ready to start down paying these things? Do you have any suggestions?
But we haven't talked about the 800-pound gorilla in the room.
Oh, tell us what the 800-pound gorilla is.
Student loan debt.
Oh, you're right.
That seems to be a topic that's all-consuming.
It is.
Is that good debt or bad debt?
Well, is it? What do you think?
Well, you received an education for it, so some would put it as good debt, but it just unfortunately, going through college at this point is so expensive that this debt is kind of really putting straps on folks who are recent grads, just trying to move forward and plan monthly when you have this debt hanging over you is really difficult. So great thing to do at this point is, again, not try to get into some consumer debt and pile that on top of your student loan, but it's just to work out in your budget, can we accelerate payments a little bit on our student loan to get out from underneath it? If not, it's just going to be part of our overall budget, and we have to adjust other spending accordingly. Now, that's easier said than done, obviously.
Yeah.
But go back to Colin's example before about housing. So if I'm a recent grad and I'm looking to, at different places to live, and I'm looking at rent, I may have to adjust a little bit, and unfortunately, I may have to adjust downward a little bit to make sure that I can cover my student debt.
Mm-hmm.
And then once you see the light at the end of the tunnel with the student loans, then you can start allocating that money elsewhere. But that is the 800-pound gorilla for many of us who are trying to do all these different things and save and build our career at the same time, and this debt kind of looms over us. So we have to be real cognizant of this debt when we're doing our monthly budget.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if you say, let's say we have somebody who has several different kinds of debt. So let's say somebody has a student loan, they also have a car payment, they have some credit card debt, maybe something else. What would you recommend in terms of a strategy of which one they should tackle first?
Well, you have to pay off certain ones first. So your loans, okay, you have to meet this schedule.
Right.
So there's less flexibility there. So let's assume you have the student debt and a car loan, for example. Well, obviously those are payments that are required. So those would be part of your budget. And then if you have some other, like credit card debt, for example, and you have maybe 2 or 3 of them, I'd put them in order of highest interest first. So the one that has the highest interest rate, I need to pay a little bit more than the minimum payment, otherwise I'll never get out from under that. So just kind of list them out in order. There are ways to refinance that. Some credit cards do offers where you can refinance it, but those are really short-term solutions.
And then you get the snowball effect, where once the highest one's paid off, then you start allocating that money toward the next one, and so on and so forth. So you get the snowball effect, and things get paid off very quickly.
And if possible, avoid piling more debt on those cards as you're paying them off, because again, we go back to our emergency fund. Something happens, and you're suddenly about to pay off your credit card, and unfortunately something happens where you need to charge something else. So you have to be really careful that it's not just purchases that you want.
Great. All right. So with that, let's talk a little bit. You touched on this briefly. You talked about your monthly spending and your monthly budget. So when we talk a little bit about budgeting, obviously we want to keep our debt below a certain amount of our monthly budget, but what would you allocate for other things in terms of people's lifestyle? And I know that this varies differently depending on where we live and what our scenario is, but if you look over at Worksheet for a monthly budget, in terms of your variable expenses and things like your fixed expenses, what are sort of your rule of thumbs for things like insurance and how much you should be saving each month just for a general after-tax savings account, your savings account through your employer plan, things like this? What do you normally recommend in terms of those types of allocations? That's
a great question. Well, you have your fixed expenses, you have your variable expenses. Insurance is one of those interesting things. I was saying, it's one of those products where once you need it, it's too late to buy it.
Yeah.
Roughly from an insurance standpoint, just as a side note, we want to make sure that you buy enough insurance to cover your debts and replace 5 years of in your salary.
Okay.
And that's especially if you have a household, you're married with children, things like that. You want to take care of your spouse or your partner. In terms of fixed expenses, we want to line those up because, again, depending on where you're listening to this in what part of the country, there are going to be different fixed expenses for housing, your utilities, things like that. We want to make sure that once those fixed expenses are under control, then we know what we have to spend with the rest of it. But you mentioned savings. We want to make sure we're putting 10% of our income away in our employer-sponsored retirement plan. A lot of people think of that as 401k. Maybe you're covered by 403b. Also, another 10% in your emergency fund.
Okay.
And so I think once you have your fixed expenses, then you have your savings for retirement and your savings for your emergency fund, then we can see, okay, what do we have for discretionary?
Okay.
And it may be a determination whether or not you get to shop at Whole Foods that week for your groceries or not. We always kind of joke about that, but you have to be smart about, am I eating beans and rice, or as Joe like to say, cans or bottles, for your weekly spending habits.
Yeah, just to add to that a little bit, I would. It's really important that in the beginning when you're doing your budgeting, don't get discouraged if you're like, wow, there's no way I'm getting to 10% in a retirement plan and 10% in my general savings. It's just I don't have enough room there. So you always look at it as something to work towards. So when you're first doing your budget, you're going through your monthly spending, please don't get discouraged if you're not able to save 20%. I mean, that's the ideal. So the reality would state for most people that, hey, how do I work towards 20% is a good way to look at it. So when you're looking at your overall variable expenses, this is where you have a little bit of room. And we always pick on going to some coffee places that tend to be pretty expensive. And people are like, well, I don't overspend. And then I see them constantly carrying around these coffee cups that cost $5 a brew, and they have them 5 days a week. I'm thinking, well, there's $100 a month right there. Not that we don't want you drinking coffee, but you just have to think a little bit harder about where you're spending your money, because overall, if you can get your monthly spending in control and feel real confident with that, over time, saving becomes a little bit easier, and then reaching some of your financial goals later also becomes a lot easier.
Yeah, and so let's say you have somebody who has to kind of make that decision on a tight budget between focusing that money in savings, or they really want to tackle their debt first. Which would you recommend if they have to choose between the two, or would you recommend sort of splitting that up? Which should they be focusing on more?
Ideally, you could split it up, but it all depends on the amount of debt. So we'd say, hey, look, split it up for now to get the emergency savings account handled. Because again, Murphy's Law, if you're paying off debt and suddenly the transmission and the air conditioner blow up at the same time, you're going to just keep piling on that debt. So ideally, split them in the beginning to get your 3 months emergency savings, and once you have that taken care of, then you can go a little bit more aggressively after the debt, with the long-term goal of doing that, getting somewhere close to that 20% in a long-term savings.
And I get that question a lot right now. It's, do I pay off my student loan debt or do I save for my retirement plan?
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
tough, and we want to find a way to do it all. But when you're struggling to, hey, can I afford a car loan to get to work or not? Those are tough decisions, and people are faced with those every single day. So we want to make sure we are, in a historically low interest rate environment. And so we want to take advantage of that whenever we can in terms of consolidation and refinance. But when we talk about good debt and bad debt, having a mortgage, a lot of people consider to be good debt. Student loan debt, as Joe alluded to, you got an education. It's enabling you to earn a living. A lot of people say that that's good debt as well. So you want to make sure you manage that while not forsaking the emergency fund in your long-term savings plan.
Sure. So one question I do want to ask, so when we're looking over again at this monthly budget and we're looking at the savings, what do you think about for families with children? What are the best savings vehicles that they have in order to save for them and for their future?
Well, first, bank account to just save the basic cash for the emergency fund.
Yeah,
and then
absolutely.
When they're trying to save for long-term, let's say education, there's many different ways to do it. Obviously, the 529 plan is really attractive because depending on what state you live in and what accounts you use, you have a little bit of an income tax break up front, and then you have some tax favorable growth within the 529 plan. But again, I would focus on the basic savings first, and then I'd flip over to different savings accounts. So there's 2 or 3 forms of savings accounts for education. It kind of depends on where you are and what you're trying to save for.
Right.
Most people are so stressed. Let's go back to our student debt. I may be paying down student debt now. I have children. I'm worried about their education, so it becomes a focus of mine to save for them. You could start when they're really young and start at a small amount and start building that up, and that's where the 529 comes in as a very popular vehicle for saving for students, for your children's future college tuition payments.
Well, I do have to say, though, I was at the bank this past weekend, and my 13-year-old son got his first checking account debit card, so he was very fired up about having his own little Visa card. So he went straight to the comic book store and just tried to spend all $25 we put in there.
Sounds like your son might need to be tuning into this little
he needs
session
to look
here.
At worksheet number 4.
Do as I say, not as I do.
That's great. That is great. So let's move on. Let's talk a little bit about our 12-month spending plan. So if we take a look at this, you can see that we're dividing up income based on salary, bonuses, other different features. So when you're creating a 12-month spending plan, let's say personally, what are those big things that you focus on, those big expenditures that you're focusing on annually, and how do you divide up your planned expenses and your planned savings?
The first thing I'd say is when you go through the monthly budget, it gives you a pretty good roadmap for this 12-month spending plan. This is not a fun exercise for most people.
No, it's
Sitting down
not.
saying, okay, where am I going to spend my money unless it's a vacation, right? So the importance of the 12-month spending plan is to just a roadmap. You just look at it as a financial roadmap of what we're trying to accomplish throughout the year.
Right.
And obviously you take from your monthly budget the big expenditures that you have to have, those fixed expenses we talked about earlier. And then what you want to put in the overall budget is, hey, are there going to be any other expenses along the line, the nice-to-haves? And a vacation would be a prime example. Again, trying to avoid more consumer debt and using your credit card to go on vacation. If you can map it out that each month you put a little bit aside for that, or any other expenditures you may know that are coming through, it allows you just to map that out over the year and make it a little bit more manageable. So we like the 12-month spending plan, and we recommend people go through this once or twice a year.
Yeah.
Maybe take a snapshot in the summer and take a look at it and say, hey, I'm on target. I said I was going to do this throughout the year. Am I actually doing it when it comes to my monthly budget? But like anything, it's just a really good way to look back a little bit, but also to look forward on your overall finances.
Right, especially when we're in the beginning of the year or in the middle of the year. But any time that we are trying to set some good 12-month goals, this is a really good time to sit down and channel that excitement of setting 12-month goals into something that's a little bit more productive. While this might not be as fun of an exercise as Joe was mentioning, it's definitely valuable, especially from a familial standpoint when you're planning with your spouse or your partner or your household, in terms of setting goals of what you're going to accomplish for the whole year.
Well, when we're doing one-on-one meetings, we get asked quite often, are there budgeting tools? And since we don't have any commercial sponsors, I will not name names, but if you reach out to us and contact one of us directly, we can go over a few different budgeting tools. But that's why the worksheets are great. You can obviously use an Excel-type spreadsheet, but there are some great tools out there that help you map out. And the interesting thing from that exercise, and it's great to do it, I always mention around tax time as well, because you can kind of assess what happened in the previous year and then do some forward looking for the next year. And you can see the seasonality also of your spending habits.
That's a great point.
There are some tools out there to try to smooth out your utility bills. You can see the ebbs and flows versus gas and electric. You can see how much you're spending on cable and maybe cut the cord. So there are some things you can look back and say, I didn't realize I was spending that much, on that item. And then you can, try to, New Year's are great for resolutions, right? That's why I joined the gym,
How's that going?
Yeah. Hey, I have an app. It tracks how many times I've been this month. So been more days than not in this month. So
nice.
It's good stuff.
That is good. So let's take a look at a worksheet 6. So when it talks about how long it will actually take to pay off your debt, this is something that can be really daunting. So we're talking about debt amounts, and then we're talking about monthly payments. But what we're really trying to focus on is we have this 12-month spending plan. Oftentimes, when we're paying off our debt, it might actually take longer than that. So how do we factor this in when it comes to thinking about debt and setting a time period in order to pay it off?
Yeah, so again, back to this not being a fun exercise, but it's important. When you look at trying to manage the overall debt and pay that down, this is a really good way to just take, again, inventory of where you are today, and don't be discouraged. I mean, take a look at it and say, okay, well, it may stink that I'm in this position, but how am I going to move forward and get out of it? And worksheet 6 is designed to show you how long it may take to pay off that debt, and then it's just a goal. Am I going to be able to break through that and pay it off a little bit quicker? Am I going to have, for example, let's say I receive extra compensation or a bonus at work, am I going to allocate part of that to pay off my debt?
Right.
Things along those lines. So again, some of the hardest things to go through is when you're doing a budget is to take a snapshot of that debt and figure out how we're going to pay it down. And this is a really good way to just take a look at it, because what most people don't realize is when you're carrying debt like a credit card and it has interest, and sometimes that interest rate's pretty high, it may take a really long time to pay it off by just paying those minimum payments or close to those minimum required payments. So this is a really good way to look at it and say, how am I going to break through that? How am I going to get out from under this? And knowing how long it's going to take to pay down your debt may give you incentive to pay it off a little bit quicker. I'd rather have money going in your savings account than you're paying the bank interest on a credit card. So how are we going to get to that point?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is actually kind of, to put a positive spin on this, it can be a motivational practice because you can actually see how much your total cost is throughout this whole repayment period of the debt that you owe. And while it can be a little bit frustrating for me personally when I see how much that actually costs me in the long term with interest, it's much more motivational in trying to tackle it and get ahead of it so that I don't actually spend as much as, what that interest rate is going to cost me.
Well, if I can use a 50-cent word, the table you see on the worksheet 6 is an amortization schedule.
Yeah.
And I will endorse a website. There, I do mention every time I'm meeting with folks or doing webinars, bankrate.com has tons of calculators. It's a free site. They have their own commercials, so I'll let them promote their own commercials on their website. But bankrate.com has tons of calculators for every kind of debt imaginable. And so that it will definitely help anyone who wants to run a calculator before getting into debt And also, if you're consolidating debt or you are curious about accelerating your debt payments, great resource to be able to help you, get a handle on that and really get ahead of it, or prevent yourself from getting into, debt.
Yeah, that's a really good thing to point out when we are making those sort of, whether they're impulse purchases or whether they're long-term planning purchases, like buying a car or something like this that we need to be thinking about. Those are really good tools that you're mentioning, bankrate.com and such, to actually sort of quantify what the value is of what we're about to purchase when we factor in the fact that we need to go into some debt in order to plan for those things. So this has been really great. I really appreciate the two of you taking the time to go through this. Any final comments, any other special tips that two of you may have?
I would just say that, very popular now are these aggregation websites.
Yeah, absolutely.
Things like mint.com, where you can go and put in your information. There's a lot of questions around cybersecurity and and making sure that your information's safe.
Yeah.
So I'm sure that we'll save that for another webinar, but make sure that you're utilizing all those great technological resources out there to help you get your arms around your personal finances.
Yeah, and I would say some of the real important points that we covered today is, again, this is just a good way to look at this is you're taking a snapshot of where you are today, then figuring out how you can manage where you are today, for example, focusing on emergency savings and paying down debt, so you can move forward financially. When you go through the budgeting exercise, it just be very realistic would be my number one tip. Just be honest with yourself. Nobody's going to judge you about your budget, but really be honest with yourself and figure out where you're spending money, so you can lay out where you're going to spend over the next 12 months, so you can move forward and hit some of those savings goals. And it may not be a savings goal, it may be the debt reduction plan. But whatever the case may be, just be honest with yourself when you're looking at this budget. And the more you do this, the easier it becomes. And there's, as Colin mentioned before, a lot of apps out there that will help you with budgeting. But it doesn't need to be that complicated. It can be really simple, where you just sketch things out and get a very realistic picture of where you are today.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Joe, and thank you, Colin, for your time. I really appreciate it. I hope that you all find these worksheets informative and useful. I know that they seem daunting when you look at them, but the hardest thing about doing them is actually getting started and jumping in. But once you do, you'll find that your finances can definitely be manageable on a day-to-day basis, as well as month-to-month, annually. And this is a really great starting point for taking control of your finances and working your way towards financial wellness.